Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. My name is Neve if you've not been here before, and I really hope that you stay. Today's video is super exciting. You might have already guessed considering the jumper is back on, but today we are continuing my series where I analyse the 2016 Broadway revival of Falsettos. In part 1 we had a look at the set design. If you've not seen that part already, you are more than welcome to go and check it out. I have a playlist where all the videos will be going so that they're easy to find. Today, however, we're going to be looking at the costume for the show, which is also very exciting. Apologies in advance if you do see me looking down a little bit. I have my laptop with me with the blog piece that I've written about it. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anything and that you guys aren't missing anything that's like interesting, so I've got it there just to keep me right. Let's jump straight in. Okay, so the costume for this piece was designed by Jennifer Caprio. I'm going to link in the description an interview that she did about these costumes, because some of the things that she says in the interview informed some of my points here, or I make these points, and I will make sure to try my best to tell you which points I'm making that I got from there, but I will link that in the description for you to have a read. I'm also going to link in the description a really interesting blog piece that someone else wrote about the costumes for this piece, as they made a fascinating point about colour and how it was used to portray character relationships, and it absolutely blew my mind, and I thought that if you guys find this one interesting you would also find that interesting, so that will be in the description for you to have a look if you fancy it. Okay, so the first thing that I took into account when I was thinking about the costumes of this production were their period accuracy. Act 1 of Falsettos is set in 1979 and Act 2 is set in 1981, so I was looking out for mostly 70s fashion, but definitely expecting, as the production ran on, some 80s fashion to be introduced through Act 2. An important point that Jennifer Caprio made in her interview that I was sort of aware of but didn't maybe know the extent of it is that decades of fashion, the way we perceive them, are very different from how decades of fashion work, in that 70s fashion was actually very popular right up until about the mid-80s, and 80s fashion ran into like the mid-90s. Obviously it takes a while for new trends to establish themselves and for old ones to die out. I assumed that the fashions of each decade ran a little into the next one, but I didn't realise that. I think in the interview she says that 70s fashion ran up until about 1985, which is a lot further into the 80s than I expected it to be the fashion. So I definitely, upon learning that, viewed the costumes for this in a slightly different light and understood why there was less of a change than I maybe had originally anticipated there'd be the first time that I watched it through. I will, however, say I think that the costumes for this production match the time period exceptionally well. As someone who is not the most knowledgeable about fashion and fashion trends, I thought it would be harder for me personally to spot 70s fashion, but it was done so well and there were so many elements included that I automatically knew that that's what I was looking at, which I really enjoyed. For example, Trina's costumes in particular follow silhouettes that to me very heavily associated with the 70s, the main one being her sort of wide-legged flowy trousers, and that sort of like flared shape of her trousers were to me very synonymous with the 70s, but also in other things she wore I thought also followed 70s silhouettes, or at least the 70s silhouettes that I recognised. There were other silhouettes as well that she wore that I thought were very 70s. For example, when she wore skirts, they were often like maxi skirts, and in my head maxi dresses and maxi skirts were very popular items of clothing and lengths of your clothing in the 70s. Whenever Trina came out on stage, that was like a reminder for me. I was always very keenly aware that that was the time it was set, and I think that to me Trina's costume, especially in the first act, was the biggest reminder of that, not only through the shape of her clothing but also through the colour. When I think of the 70s, and I think when most people think of the 70s, the colour palette that you're thinking of is like, you know, rusty oranges and warm browns and yellows and sort of like greens that are much closer to yellows, or at least are much warmer in shade than they are the blue that they're mixed with. And Trina's costume, especially in the first act, is made up pretty much entirely of those oranges and yellows and browns which was to me overwhelmingly 70s. We also see little bits in the other characters, and I'm sure it's featured heavily in the other characters, but I noticed it definitely much more in Trina. But there are other things that I definitely noticed. For example, in Marvin's Act 1 costume, the first outfit we see him in, he's wearing a crocheted tie that is orange. And I know if you interact with Falsettos content online, you'll know that everyone hates the crochet tie because it's very ugly, which is true, but crochet made a massive comeback as a fashion trend around the 70s, and most documentation of it I could find online was definitely in relation to women's fashion, but I did see a lot of crocheted ties when I was looking into whether or not crochet was a 70s trend and what 70s fashion trends were generally. I seen a lot of crocheted ties, so I definitely, when I rewatched it after doing the research to like fine-tune my points, was much more keenly aware of, despite its ugliness, how relevant that hideous tie was. I definitely think Whizzer's like whole thing is very 70s 80s. I think his costume's probably the one that changes the most as the decades change, which makes a lot of sense because Whizzer is very fashionable and he cares a lot about how he looks, and he tells us that he has an interest in and a dedication to the styles that are in at the moment. So it makes a lot of sense that as Act 1 fades into Act 2, he's one of the first people to really get on the new trends, which we see in the opening of Act 2 in Falsetto Land, when he comes out in his bright pink polo neck and his jumper tied across his shoulders, which to me is very like 80s Malibu Barbie type outfit, which definitely communicated to us that some time had passed, or at least it did to me. One thing I also found really interesting as Act 1 fades into Act 2 is how the colour palette starts to very subtly change. There is introduction of colours that most people associate with the 80s, which are much brighter colours like bright pinks and turquoises and like a dark blue but a bright blue like royal blue, and like mint greens, colours that are very 80s. We see the beginning of that in Falsetto Land. Trina is wearing this beautiful like pink jumper with her skirt with the roses on it, and then in A Day in Falsetto Land she's wearing arguably the most 80s outfit the show provides us with, which is her workout leotard leg warmer combo and Mendel with his matching sports coat, which not only look very 80s in the actual items they are and the association they have with 80s pop culture and 80s fashion trends, but also the colour scheme they are. There are those turquoises and pinks and colours that are very bold and bright and that you inherently associate with the 80s and home workout videos and things like that. I thought it was very smart to have those outfits included, but also for them to be the colours that they were. I definitely also think A Day in Falsetto Land is one of the biggest moments where we get to see the culmination of 80s fashion and the way it's been introduced. Cordelia is wearing her light wash jeans and her crop top, which again I thought was very young adult in the 80s. When I think of looking at vintage fashion, looking for fashion inspiration for myself that's set in the 80s and 90s, those are the outfits that definitely come into my head. And again, Whizzer, his like big leather jacket that's like not the same leather jacket as the Act 1 leather jacket, which was much tighter and more blazer like. It's like a buffer leather jacket, and I think there was like that thing in the 80s where men's jackets were quite boxy and oversized. I just think there was a very fine eye to detail in the way these costumes transitioned through Act 1 into Act 2, and how well the costumes fit the time period that this is set in a way that was easily recognisable even to people who necessarily weren't old enough to be alive then and have that first-hand experience of living through wearing those clothes. I think they did a very good job of making sure that that was not necessarily accessible, but perhaps that they'd dumbed it down for the younger audiences. I feel mean saying dumbed it down because that's not necessarily what I mean, but you know, I wouldn't understand the complexities of or like niche parts of 70s fashion, so I think them choosing the items that they did were excellent choices because it meant that people who didn't have a keen awareness of the fashion of the time but like knew enough from pop culture and stuff like that were still able to recognise and be immersed in that time period that the show is set in. The next thing that I want to discuss in relation to the costumes for this show are moments in which they are used to portray character and symbolism and stuff like that. The biggest one for me, or at least the most interesting one for me, is definitely the way Marvin's costume reflects his character growth. In Act 1, he is very business casual. He is dressed to resemble and become the working man of the family. And I think what's so smart about that is, without having to say anything to us, you make connotations in your head of that sort of like working man of the house to be someone who is quite emotionally unavailable and detached and not committed to his family and being vulnerable. And you make these connections in your head without anyone having to say anything to you about this family man who dresses smart to go to work every day, perhaps being emotionally distant and not being vulnerable, or spending quality time with your family and being someone who's not necessarily absent, but that sort of like absent working man stereotype. I feel like is a connotation that you make based off of just that costume, and it's an accurate connotation because that is what Marvin in Act 1 is like. He refuses to be vulnerable. He is desperate to keep himself in and present in this stereotypical masculine member of a nuclear family. He wants to be the working man. He wants to have the power. He doesn't want to make any sort of deep emotional bond that would make him vulnerable. But he does want all that, which you sort of start to really understand as the show goes on. But he's so afraid of letting go of the misogyny and the internalized homophobia that he's keeping within himself, that he's pushing himself to perform this role all of the time. And his costume shows us that. It looks uncomfortable, he looks uncomfortable, it's not casual, there's no personality in it, it's just clothes that he wears so that he looks smart, is taken seriously so he can go to work. But then as the show progresses and, you know, his sort of breakdown happens and we move into Act 2 and him and Whizzer get back together, his costumes become much more casual and much more comfortable, and I think that's a show of his growth. He is more willing to be vulnerable in front of the people that he loves. He, in Act 2, is much more capable of, as we see, making and maintaining emotional bonds. He has friends. Him and Trina are on somewhat good terms. Him and Whizzer are back together and their relationship is the healthiest it's ever been. They both seem genuinely happy, and that's definitely reflected in these like comfy jumpers that he wears. I found this really interesting because at first when his costumes start to get casual, it's not a good thing. As Act 2 progresses and we sort of run full speed ahead towards this like breaking point, his costumes begin to like unravel and he's wearing these jumpers and he looks a mess and he's ranting and raving and he hits Trina, and that's like the turning point of his growth of the story that thus far. At first I thought that these casual clothes were a sign of his lack of growth, his spin out of control, but then we see him when he hits Trina, when we hit this breaking point and these comfortable clothes remain, he is actively working on bettering himself. So the way I now think of it is, yes, he was spinning out of control, but in spinning out of control he was unwillingly or unknowingly becoming incredibly vulnerable, and he hit a point of no return and realised that he could not continue the way he was going and began to allow himself to be vulnerable in a way that was constructive and healthy. And that's why this clothing remained the way it was. The vulnerability was the same, but this time it was by choice and in a healthy manner. He was letting his emotions out in a way that worked for him, in a way that did not hurt the people around him. But the reason the clothing started to become this casual clothing before this point is, although when this kind of emotional version of himself started, it was not necessarily the good thing that it became, but they have that in common. The next thing, and the thing that I found to be such a lovely, simple touch, which is also a costume to communicate Marvin's growth, is in A Day in Falsetto Land, and again I think in More Racquetball. Marvin is wearing these red shorts that have rainbows up the outside seams. It was just such a lovely touch to me because in itself it doesn't seem like it says a lot, but it's communicating all this work that he's done to get to the place that he is now, where he is able to say, yes, I am a gay man, I'm happy and comfortable in this identity as this person. It's not something that I need to change or hide or control to make half of what it really is, the way he seemed very keen and desperate to do in the first act. It's just such a small gesture, it just made me really happy, and it continues to do so every time I watch Falsettos. I see the thing come on and I'm like, oh, it's his little shorts. On that same vein in terms of racquetball outfits, but one that is not quite so cheery but is so impressive to me. It took me, I think it was the second or third time I watched Falsettos before I properly noticed it and I was in a state, is Whizzer's racquetball costume changes size between A Day in Falsetto Land and More Racquetball. In A Day in Falsetto Land, his racquetball costume is very tight, it fits him very well to show off his like athleticism, I guess. It's toned. He obviously does this often because he's wearing like the proper like all white racquetball outfit. And then in More Racquetball, his clothes are hanging off of him. His shorts, which were previously pretty much melded to his thighs, are baggy and hanging off of him, and his t-shirt is the same. Everything looks like it's stretched about 3 sizes. And obviously at the end of this song, or I suppose the start of this song, is the start of the rapid decline of Whizzer's health. And I just thought this was so smart because it's very well known that one of the biggest, or one of the most well known symptoms of AIDS was rapid and severe weight loss. And I think having this costume like change and him come out and these clothes not fitting him, and obviously if you've watched Falsettos you'll know in this song he's very weak and he's like panting and definitely not on his usual very athletic form, and then he collapses at the end of the number. But I think having this from the get-go of that song, you're just so keenly aware, even if you don't necessarily notice that that's what's changed, that the costume is bigger, something doesn't seem right. Something's wrong, it's uncomfortable, something just seems out of place. And then when he collapses and you're like, oh no, even again if you still haven't recognised this costume and the way it fits, you understand why. It was almost as if you could feel it coming, and I think that makes it all the more emotional. I think it connects with you more because there is a build up even before he starts playing and is not doing very well. Just the minute he comes out in that costume that doesn't fit him and you're like, what is wrong here? Something isn't correct. And then he collapses and you're like, oh, he's really not well. And then when it does eventually click with you, the costume thing, I just think it's like, just like hits very hard. And the minute I did notice it, I now can't look at that song the same. And I also find it difficult now to look at the number in A Day in Falsetto Land when they're playing racquetball and they're all happy and he's like, whoa, because I'm like, no, the next time I see you like this, it's all downhill from there. I have one more point to make and then I will wrap today's video up. And the last thing I will be discussing is in What Would I Do, Whizzer comes out and they sing their duet, and Whizzer's shirt is white. He's wearing his Act 1 outfit, only instead of this sort of like mint greeny blue shirt that he had on in Act 1, he's wearing a white shirt. I don't know if I'm thinking too much into this one, because I think what could be a very obvious but very effective meaning of this is just Whizzer passes away off stage, so him coming out in this white shirt is like, you know, like white has the connotations of like angels and heaven, so you're aware that yes, he has actually died, he's not alive when they sing this duet. I also think in the song Marvin starts talking about how he's going to start forgetting things about Whizzer, and I think it would be really interesting if this decision to have the shirt be white is like a reflection of that. Marvin is not about to start forgetting things about Wizard, he already is forgetting things about Wizard. Because I think that's like the reality of losing someone, the small details of the memories you have of them start to fade. You don't remember the specifics, and I think that having him come out in a costume that's just slightly wrong from what we all remember would be a really intelligent but also just like almost comforting reflection of that, because yes, it's absolutely heartbreaking, but it is a universal experience that when you lose someone you start to lose the finer details. Because obviously Marvin is distraught about it, and I think having that like, oh yeah, that happens to me too, is very sad. It definitely like enhances the absolute pain of that song, that duet. But there was something about it to me that was comforting, just because of how human it was, I think. And it was also, again, very interesting. I think the costumes for this production as a whole are just spectacular. They did a fantastic job of communicating time period. The symbolism they were used for when they were used for that was done so well, and in a way that was easy enough to grasp if you were looking for it, but also subtle and so well woven in and so in character. Like the rainbow shorts thing, if that was not a reflection of Marvin, if Marvin hadn't taken the steps to get there, it would just be weird. You'd be like, oh yeah, just because he's gay, like, you're putting him in rainbow shorts. But knowing the journey and the work that Marvin's went through, they were lovely. And I just think the awareness and the understanding that the costume team for this production had of these characters and the show and the journeys that they went on, I just thought was fantastic. And every time I watch it, I feel like I find something new that I love, or I pick up something new. It's not necessarily like a massive point that I could make, but it's just like, oh, I didn't realise that before, or oh, that's really interesting. So I definitely recommend, even if you've already seen Falsettos, to go and have a watch again and see what you noticed the second time around that you didn't notice the first time around. Okay, so that is it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to like, and if you haven't already, subscribe. I aim to post every Monday, so there'll be a new video next week. If you haven't already seen the set design video, part 1 of this series, it is in a playlist on my channel. You can go and have a look at that. I'll see you all very soon. Bye bye.